Hey guys, it's the Metalblade 5, and welcome to my response to Anita Sarkeesian's Not Your Exotic Fantasy and the Lady Sidekick videos. So between the previous response video and now, I ran out of videos to cover on my backlist. But then I just randomly remembered, alright, feminist frequency is still a thing, and they've probably made more Tropes vs. Women in video games, in which I was right. But then I found out that these two videos are actually the last two videos in the series. It's over now, and since I covered Anita before, in which I went overboard during the end by blowing out everybody's eardrums and calling her a bitch, I thought that I might as well finish this off. But, like I said in my previous response to Anita, while I do dislike her and feminists in general, that isn't because of what they campaign for. It's because of the way they go about it, such as trying to say that video games reinforce sexist ideas with incoherent reasons in this case. So this video isn't about me trying to maintain patriarchy or whatever. Second is that I do not condone the threats that Anita has received over the years, like rape and death threats, so I'm not trying to encourage them. And I think that's everything I need to say, so let's just get into this. Of course, starting with the Not Your Exotic Fantasy video as it came out first. And this video covers the apparent negative portrayal of black and other cultural women in video games.
Ubisoft's 2012 game Far Cry 3 cast players as Jason Brody, a young white American man vacationing in Bangkok with his brother and their white friends. But their carefree fun comes to an end when a skydiving trip goes wrong and they all end up being kidnapped by evil pirates who, you guessed it, are not white.
Okay, I know this isn't a major part of the video, but it does reflect something Anita says later on. The pirates are not white. The majority of modern-day pirates are black, and in Far Cry, the pirates are obviously more like modern ones as they carry guns, so the fact that they're of a different ethnicity is related to real-world facts.
Jason escapes and encounters a group of island natives called the Rakyat, who enlist his help to rid their island of the pirates, ushering Jason into his exotic and exciting new role as a tribal warrior and white savior is Citra, a young woman who's viewed among her people as a warrior goddess. Under her guidance, Jason's adventure rapidly becomes an absurd hodgepodge of racist stereotypes about tribal cultures and brown women.
So, because there's a tribe and Citra's black, that means Far Cry 3 is racist towards tribal cultures and black women? If it treats those things as inferior to white culture and shows prejudice towards them, then that is racist. But with Far Cry 3, they're just aspects of the plot. If anything, they're presenting them in a more positive light, as without help from the tribe, Jason wouldn't have been able to stop Voss. And I'm not taking Anita's words out of context here, as immediately after this, she talks about Citra's role in the plot, including her topless and sex scene. Speaking of which, I'm skipping that part because it ultimately amounts to what you'll see next, and because I don't want this video to be age-restricted because they don't censor Citra's boobies.
On one hand, Citra is yet another example of a female character whose sexuality is presented as a motivator and reward for the presumed straight male player.
Even though the ending where you have sex with her is considered the bad ending because Jason kills his friends and then Citra kills him, but whatever.
But there's something more insidious happening with Citra. Her body paint and magical powers suggest she practices some sort of tribal mysticism, which also roots her in a long-standing tradition of racist stereotypes. These elements of sexism and racism intersect, turning Citra into a stereotype of an exotic, primitive, mystical, savage, sexualized woman of color. This linking of sexism and racism is an example of what's called exotification. Exotification occurs when a group is treated as inherently different, alluring, and strange.
Like a lamb to the slaughter.
For instance, when certain white men falsely view Asian women as inherently more obedient or submissive than women from other cultures and sexually fetishize them as a result of these false notions, those women are being exotified, and their race is falsely depicted as the defining aspect of their character and personality.
While I can't speak for those movies, since I haven't seen them, in the case of Citra, her race doesn't define her character or personality. While I've not played Far Cry 3, I do know that Citra is kind of like a crazy ex-girlfriend in a way, as she is obsessed with Jason due to a combination of being in love with him and wanting to give birth to a warrior child. Her obsessive and somewhat psychotic nature is what defines her character more than her ethnicity.
Sometimes black female characters are exotified entirely through clothing that simultaneously sexualizes them while also evoking racist stereotypes. 2009's Resident Evil 5 introduced a new character to the series, Sheva Alomar, a Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance agent who joins Chris Redfield as he confronts an outbreak of infected in a fictional region of Africa. The first time you play through the game, Sheva looks like this. However, once the story has been completed, if players also collect all 30 BSAA tokens scattered throughout the levels, they unlock a new outfit for Sheva called the Tribal Costume. Equipping this outfit takes Sheva, who up until this point has been wearing somewhat practical attire for the work she's doing, and shoves her into a leopard print bikini top and a few tatters of fabric around her waist, while also applying paint markings to decorate her face and body.
But it's an alternate costume. It's not what Sheva canonically wears in the game. Her default outfit is much more practical. And I know I'm treading on thin ice here, as there was a lot of controversy around this costume with people claiming that it's racist, but I honestly fail to see how that's the case. This is because there are African tribes in the real world who do wear few tatters of fabric or animal hides, whilst also being covered in markings. The only difference that Sheva's tribal costume has to these is that she's wearing a bikini, but seeing as how a lot of women in these tribes wear little or nothing to cover their boobs, that could potentially be the explanation why. Plus, Resident Evil 5 takes place in Africa, so it does fit the environment. If the game took place in somewhere like America, and Sheva still had that outfit because she's African, then I could see it more as being racist. But I see it more as referencing the kinds of tribes found where the game is based. As for being sexy, this isn't exclusive to Sheva, as both Chris's default outfit and one of his costumes clearly show off his gigantic muscles.
In Hyrule Warriors, the villain Sia is one half of the spirit of the original sorceress, a noble being who watched over the balance of the Triforce. When the evil Ganondorf drives the light from the sorceress's soul, she splits into two, with her virtuous half becoming Lana, who, like the similarly righteous Link in Zelda, is fair-skinned. Meanwhile, her evil half becomes the darker-skinned Sia, who casts dark magic, wears an extremely sexualized outfit, and whose body is adorned with markings reminiscent of tribal body paint. These differences between Lana and Sia, two halves of the same being, directly link the color of their skin to their goodness and virtue, falsely suggesting that a lighter skin tone reflects a purer, more noble spirit. In reality, lighter-skinned women of color are often depicted as more desirable and more virtuous because they come closer to meeting the culturally dominant white beauty standards. This insidious notion that a darker skin tone reflects a less moral or virtuous soul is hardly new to the Zelda franchise, in which the heroic and noble characters like Link and Zelda are fair-skinned, while the recurring villain Ganondorf is associated with the darker-skinned Gerudo people.
This gives me some horrible flashbacks to some article that claimed Ocarina of Time was racist for similar reasons. My issue with this point on skin color in regards to both Sia and Ganondorf also reflects an issue I have with the point on the Far Cry pirates not being white. Just because a villain is black doesn't mean that they're saying black people are evil. They're evil because of their goals, actions, or both. I never even thought about Sia's skin color until it was brought up in this video, so at least for me, her ethnicity wasn't very important. Also, this is a case of Anita cherry-picking examples, as in Hyrule Warriors, we also have Impa, who is black in the game, and she's one of the heroes. Also, the Zelda series has shown that even though Ganondorf is from the Gerudo, not all Gerudo are evil, such as Nabooru and all of the Gerudo in Breath of the Wild. Even the games themselves show that there isn't a correlation between being black and being evil.
In Diablo 3 there are 6, soon to be 7 classes to choose from, but only one of them is represented by black characters, the Witch Doctor, employing just about every visual stereotype about tribal warriors in the book. Elaborate piercings, skull masks and body paint, and carrying voodoo dolls and shrunken heads as items of power. The Witch Doctor is a caricature of tribal identity rooted in centuries-old racist imagery that has no place being perpetuated in the 21st century.
Like with Sheva's tribal costume, the Witch Doctor takes elements from real-life witch doctors and voodooism, and they aren't presented in a derogatory manner, so I don't see it as racism. Referencing or taking inspiration from tribal cultures isn't racism, it's more how they're portrayed.
It's no secret that fighting games often feature sexualized female characters, and often feature characters whose design is rooted in ethnic stereotypes. Sometimes these two elements combine in sexualized, exotified female characters. In Street Fighter IV, Elena wears, well, she wears almost nothing. But the bands that she wears on her arms, legs, and neck vaguely suggest African tribal culture, and she possesses that stereotypical character trait of a mystical connection to the earth.
Again, Elena is more based on and references African tribes, as you yourself came to that conclusion due to her attire and connection with the earth. Which isn't new, as there are tribes who wear the previously mentioned arm and neck bands and hold rituals to worship or strengthen their connection to the earth.
All these stereotypes are anything but harmless. Here in the United States, racist images and stereotypes of black women have been doing tremendous harm for centuries. In fact, false ideas about black women as inherently hypersexual beings were perpetuated in Southern slaveholding society. This was a time when oppressive Victorian ideas still held sway, creating a false sense of womanhood as inherently domestic, submissive, chaste, innocent, and modest. But the reality of black women's lives as slaves was irreconcilable with these notions. Not only were female slaves, of course, denied any and all basic rights as people, they were also often forced to be naked when on display at auctions, were regularly whipped in partial or total nudity as punishment, and were frequently sexually assaulted and raped by their owners.
Except that isn't what these characters are doing. Nor does it encourage or reinforce those ideas of black people being slaves or black women being sexually abused. Hell, racism and slavery is illegal, so that in of itself discourages upstanding people from doing it. Now, I'm skipping Anita's coverage of other feminist texts on racism towards black women because it doesn't have anything to do with how these exotic women are harmful, and more of racism present in the real world, which is more likely the result of other factors like history rather than video games.
We very rarely see portrayals of women of color in games that incorporate the cultural history of those characters in honest, respectful ways. In many ways, Alex Vance from Half-Life 2 and its follow-up episodes is a great character, and it's good to see a non-sexualized woman of color in such a prominent role, but the game isn't concerned with her cultural background. Nilin, the biracial protagonist of Remember Me, is a sexualized female protagonist, but the sexualization doesn't employ racist tropes. Like Alex, her cultural background is treated as irrelevant.
That's because Alex and Nilin aren't from tribal or exotic backgrounds. They're just black and live in a more Western or urban lifestyle, unlike a lot of the previous characters who do come from those cultures, and thus it plays a role in their history. Besides, Half-Life and Remember Me are set in science fiction environments where things like indigenous tribes are far less likely to come up due to the technology gap between them and the rest of the world.
We're at least seeing some improvement where black male protagonists are concerned. Though they're far from perfect in terms of representation, 2016's Watch Dogs 2 and Mafia 3 center black male characters and acknowledge black identity and structural racism as aspects of their characters' lives.
Like with Half-Life and Remember Me, Watch Dogs 2 and Mafia 3's protagonists are not from tribal backgrounds and are instead African American, meaning they're also just black and live a more Western lifestyle like any other American. So it makes sense that they aren't depicted in this quote-unquote racist and exotified fashion mentioned throughout this video.
One game with a female protagonist that does an excellent job of incorporating a character's cultural history and traditions is Never Alone, which stars a young girl named Nunya, a member of the Inupiat people of Alaska. Folklore and traditions of the Inupiat are incorporated throughout the game in a respectful way that enriches the player's understanding of these people and their experiences.
I don't see how the representation of Eskimos, or Inuits if you want to be politically correct, is any different to the references to tribes present with a lot of the characters in this video, because they both take inspiration from their respective cultures. The only difference I see is that with Never Alone, Nuna isn't sexualized because she has to wear a thick fur coat to survive the freezing temperatures, while the exotified women wear more revealing attire because it reflects that of the tribes they draw inspiration from.
This kind of respectful treatment of cultural history and traditions should be the norm, but instead, games more often just plunder marginalized cultures with no sense of respect and no concern whatsoever about accurately reflecting the people and traditions they're appropriating from.
This statement at the end brings me towards my biggest issue with this entire video, being that Anita appears to blur the line between cultural references and racism. A lot of these characters take inspiration from tribal cultures in a respectful way, as they do accurately depict aspects of that culture, such as their clothes and practices, whilst not being presented in a derogatory manner. If you watch Gaijin Goomba, then you can easily see the amount of research that game developers do in order to properly depict or reference various cultures from around the world. Racism is only when a group suffers from prejudice or is treated as inferior because of their race. which these characters are not. And for some of these games, they do take place in a more fantasy setting, in which tribes present might be slightly exaggerated or done in an original style due to the story being fiction, in which tribal beliefs like magic can be written in, which in of itself is almost like referencing the ideals of that culture. So with that out of the way, let's move on to the Lady Sidekick video, which of course covers the prominence of female companions who are portrayed as weak or vulnerable. Skimming the plot summary of BioShock Infinite to get to the point of this video.
So as a plot device which drives elements of the game's narrative, she's very significant. In gameplay terms, however, Elizabeth serves a different kind of role, that of a glorified door opener.
Here you go.
As with most shooters, BioShock Infinite often puts you into situations where you can't progress until you've cleared an area of enemies. The way it frequently does this is by blocking doors to the next area that can't be opened by Booker. Only Elizabeth can do this, which she does only when all the enemies have been killed. For all of her tremendous powers, Elizabeth is reduced by the game's mechanics to doing the most basic and menial of tasks, and waiting around for her to open a door becomes a significant aspect of how players experience her. Of course, she performs other actions as well, sometimes tossing Booker ammo, first aid, or other useful items, or opening tears through which he can have her summon things like weapons or killer robots to help him in combat.
And that's the reason why many gamers find Elizabeth to be one of the best companion characters in games. She's actually helpful rather than being a hindrance due to constantly giving Booker ammo and summoning offensive assists. Opening doors is only a minor ability she possesses in contrast to everything else. So here, I feel that Anita focuses way too much on Elizabeth being able to open doors, as her other abilities are far more significant to gameplay, and also shows that while Elizabeth herself is more fragile than Booker, she's still capable.
Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with the idea of characters who play a supporting role in combat situations, but Elizabeth is an example of a female sidekick who is reduced to a tool. There aren't gameplay mechanics that allow you to have meaningful interactions with her. She just opens doors and dispenses useful things, and her tear-opening powers are not her own, but yours to call on and control with the press of a button.
Elizabeth, a little help? Looks simple enough.
At other times, she's less like a person and more like a sexualized slot machine tossing you the occasional coin.
I fail to see how Elizabeth is sexualized because she lacks the qualities of other female characters that Anita has also called sexualized, like revealing outfits or big TNA. The only thing that I can think of as to how Elizabeth is sexualized, other than just because she's a woman, is because she's skinny, but just because a character is skinny doesn't mean they're sexual. As for the lack of emotional moments with Elizabeth, coming from someone who hasn't played BioShock Infinite, there are a number of emotional moments present in the game that focus on Elizabeth and her interactions with the outside world. The guitar scene is a pretty good example of that.
As a glorified gatekeeper, Elizabeth joins a long tradition of female sidekicks, including Alex from Half-Life 2 and its follow-up episodes, and Yorda from the much-beloved Ico, whose magic is needed to activate doors, staircases, and other mechanisms that allow players to advance. Yorda also has a distinction of being the quintessential example of what I call the damsel escort mission. Damsel escort missions occur when a female character joins the male player character, but is largely helpless, and rather than being a clear benefit to the player, she feels more like a burden. In Ico, players free Yorda from a cage early on. She then joins Ico on this journey, and much of the game consists of solving puzzles so that Yorda, who can't make leaps or climb walls on her own, can traverse the environment. Meanwhile, players also need to protect her from the shadow monsters who sometimes try to whisk her away. Spoiler alert. Yes, in the ending cutscene, Yorda carries Ico out of the crumbling castle, but what the narrative tells us or shows us in the end doesn't undo the impact of how we experience a character through the gameplay. Another classic damsel escort mission occurs in Resident Evil 4, where Ashley Graham, the president's daughter, has caused players tremendous frustration over the years by burdening them with the need to protect and manage her.
While yes, escort missions are tedious and typically something that most gamers despise, the point made about these female characters being vulnerable somewhat bothers me. This is because, and this is going to be kind of tough to explain without coming off the wrong way, but in the real world, there do exist some people who are more vulnerable, fragile, and less experienced in combat than others. And that applies to both men and women. It isn't a gender-exclusive thing. And in the case of Ico and Resident Evil 4, it's kind of a reflection of that, as Yorda is a young and frail girl, and Ashley is the President of the United States' daughter, meaning she obviously lacks combat and marksmanship skills compared to Leon. And just because there is a game that has a more vulnerable female character, doesn't mean that developers are saying that about all women, as there are plenty of strong female video game characters. The same holds true for men, as there are plenty of fragile male characters in games as well.
Whether they're presented as capable or helpless, female companions often encounter situations in which they just can't proceed on their own. Ellie in The Last of Us, for instance, is hardly a Yorda-like damsel, but when she encounters a body of water, she may as well be, and Joel has to go out of his way to get her across. Now look, there's a lot to admire about The Last of Us, but I guarantee you nobody's favorite part of that game was helping Ellie get across the water.
When this part came up, I saw Ellie's fear of water as a way of humanizing her, rather than making her appear weak. For the most part, Ellie is like a child prodigy, as she's fully capable of fighting against the zombies and using survival tactics. If Ellie was just like this for the whole game, then it would be harder for people to relate to her. A general rule for character design is that that character, unless they're an avatar or silent protagonist, needs to have a character flaw or some weakness to make them more relatable, otherwise they'll be Mr. or Mrs. Perfect and it creates a disconnect with the viewer. Ellie's hydrophobia is her weakness, and thus it shows that she's still human despite her extraordinary skills, which allows players to better relate with her. Now, the pushing her across the water sections, those are a different story.
A good rule of thumb is that if you spend any portion of a game carrying a female character around, it's a pretty safe bet that it at least has some elements of the damsel escort mission.
No, you're heavier than you look.
To be clear, there's nothing whatsoever inherently wrong with depictions of people helping each other in times of difficulty. If anything, we could do with a lot more narratives that focus on companionship, cooperation, and support. But the models games give us rarely offer experiences in which this kind of support is truly mutual. Instead, we see a pattern of men frequently caring and helping women in situations where they're otherwise helpless. This pattern is rooted in sexist ideas about men as protectors and women as the ones who need this kind of protection.
My thoughts on this part are the exact same as what I said before about the escort missions. While I have not played every single game shown in this montage, I do know that a lot of these female characters lack the same skills or are unsuited for the situation at hand as the male protagonist who's helping them.
It's coded into the gameplay that men are the ones who kill and protect, and that women are the ones who experience moments of helplessness and need to be carried. When these female characters are of aid to the player, it's often in rudimentary ways, as a glorified door opener, or even as a more basic tool. In the Ocarina of Time dungeon, inside Jabu Jabu's belly, players must carry the snobby Princess Ruto around, at one point even using her as a weight to press down a switch.
Another issue I have with this video is that Anita appears to overlook a lot of cases in which female sidekicks are directly involved in the action with the protagonist and even possess combat abilities outside of Elizabeth and Ellie. She mostly focuses on these more helpless sidekicks who perform basic tasks due to, again, being frailer and less suited to the situation at hand. And again, that isn't a gender-exclusive thing.
And in Metal Gear Solid 5, you've got 4 sidekick options to take with you on missions. A dog, a horse, a robot, and a woman.
But Quiet is able to hold her own, as clearly seen by the fact that she pins down a guy and almost stabs him in the mouth. And her combat abilities do come into play when used in missions. Just because she's the sidekick or whatever doesn't mean she's weak.
Finally, female companions often function as cheerleaders, doling out little ego boosts to players for gunning down bad guys or pulling off other feats.
And I have to get you out of here. Now come with me.
Along with the glorified door opening and the damsel-like aspects, female sidekicks are there to make players feel better about themselves, to make them feel important and skilled.
Nice! You did it! You did it! Wow! You're so cool! You're just trying to impress me.
Even though male characters have done this as well, and some of the examples shown were announcers rather than sidekicks, but okay.
But these interactions are rarely depicted as mutually supportive. It's not nearly as common in these scenarios for the male player character to offer emotional support to their female sidekick, to tell her that she's doing a great job. These particular sidekicks aren't designed as characters that players can actively engage in developing a relationship with. Characters who are fully fleshed out people with their own goals and desires, that sometimes require players to compromise their own wants or desires.
A lot of the games shown in this video do contain emotional moments between the male protagonist and the lady sidekick, in which the dude is the one emotionally tormented. Like in The Last of Us, where part of Joel's relationship with Ellie involves his torment over his daughter's death. Some games with female supporting characters or teammates even include the option to socialize with them, or even have them as a romance option, like in Persona, which does involve engaging in a relationship with them.
Of course, a huge number of games focus on men fighting alongside other men, and in these games, the male companions often have some of the same characteristics we sometimes see in female companions. It's very common for male characters to compliment the player on their good shooting, or to breach a door that the player character can't open himself. However, typically these characters are presented as equal participants in the conflict. In shooters ranging from Call of Duty to Gears of War, the player's male companions are armed and active, and are portrayed as playing their part to fend off or eliminate the enemy threat.
Yet, as I said earlier, there are female companions that play a more active role in the conflict.
Occasionally in these games, male characters do have to protect other men, but unlike scenarios in which men protect women, these less common instances don't reinforce pre-existing cultural attitudes about men, women, and gender. Similarly, the occasional situation in which a female character protects a male one, which happens in the 2013 Tomb Raider reboot, among other games, also isn't a problem, because it doesn't work to reinforce limiting, harmful ideas about women or men that already exist in our culture.
That's because those sexist ideas did exist centuries ago. Of course, times have changed, but since men didn't suffer from those ideas, the moments where they don't need help don't reinforce those views. So I think this statement is unfair because, like what I said before, if there is an instance in a game where a female character needs help, it doesn't mean to say the developers are saying that all women need to be protected. And the fact that there are cases of this with men shows that this is mutual between genders. Skipping the section of some positive examples, because Anita just says some of the things I mentioned earlier, but make them sound much less prevalent.
And while Trico in 2016's The Last Guardian may not be a human character, he does possess some of the characteristics we'd like to see more of in human companions in games. Asking Trico to do things isn't a simple matter of pushing a button and watching him immediately obey. He's not a simple tool, not just an extension of the player. Sometimes he's hesitant, reluctant, even frustrating, but this makes it feel more like he's a living, breathing creature with thoughts and feelings of his own.
Yet that was the thing people disliked the most in The Last Guardian, Trico being so unresponsive to your commands. I get what you're saying, but there needs to be a balance between being realistic and good game design.
And crucially, Trico is often the one protecting the player, rather than the other way around. He does not exist to fuel a power fantasy, but to allow for gameplay mechanics that focus on cooperation, care, and helping each other.
Mainly because you play as a young boy, while Trico is a giant beast, so of course the latter is going to do most of the protecting. And all that's left after that is the conclusion, so I'll end it off here. My issue with both of these videos is the same issue I have with Tropes vs. Women in video games in general, being that a lot of the time Anita doesn't look at the whole picture of a scenario, which causes her to accuse these harmless moments of being sexist and reinforcing harmful ideas about women. In these cases, it's the fact that she doesn't acknowledge the presented cultural references of being related to real-life tribes, whilst not being presented as inferior, and the fact that female companions can be active in the conflict and that vulnerability is present amongst both genders respectively. For an outsider coming across these videos, such as someone who doesn't know much about video games, they only end up hearing this one side of the story, and it's kind of like character assassination, but for games, as it paints games in a negative light, using slightly twisted information. But now that Tropes vs. Women in video games has finally come to an end, I'll never have to do another video on Anita. Unless I did a response to the Women as Background Objects video, but I honestly can't be asked to watch it. So with all these crazy shenanigans wrapped up, I'll see you guys for my next response video. I know that I'm going to get a lot of dislikes for this, but I won't let that stop me.